Well, it's really lovely to be able to welcome you to this webinar of the United Reformed Church History Society and to see so many, to me, familiar faces and some new ones too. And I know we're in for a real treat because there is there are two interrelated and wonderful stories to be told about peace petitions. And I was very privileged to go to the Temple of Peace in Cardiff only last year as part of the Welcome to Wales course for new ministers in Wales, and to discover these stories. So I'm really excited to hear more about them. I'm Susan Durber, and I now live in Haverfordwest in West Wales, and so this is a story that I'm eager to know more about. So we're going to hear first from Craig Owen, who is the Heritage Advisor at the Temple of Peace in Cardiff, and I'm sure he'll tell you a bit more about what that is. And then he will hand over to Gethin Rhys, who is, of course, a United Reformed Church minister, and who's been very actively involved in Cytûn, particularly relating ecumenical issues to the work of the Synod in Cardiff. So I'm going to pass, and all of that will take about 30 minutes, and then we will have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So can I hand over to you, Craig? And please, you have the floor, as it were, the screen. And I think you're muted.
There we are. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much, Susan, and welcome everybody. It's lovely to see such a populated screen, and great to have the opportunity to share this fascinating story that I hope will inspire and interest some of you in becoming involved in hopefully marking the centenary next year of this amazing peace petition. I'll just bring up a few slides. I'll just set a little bit of context for the story that sits behind this peace petition and the Temple of Peace itself, and I'll pass on to Gethin to delve into a little more depth. I'm hoping that I'll be successful in sharing some slides. Are you seeing slides on your screen now?
Yes.
Right. Well, although I do just need to make it full screen. There we go. So hopefully you can see what I'm seeing. Can you see four very elegant looking women on the steps of the White House? Fantastic.
Okay.
So this is about Wales and world peace and a journey back to the 1920s, to the aftermath of the First World War, as it was known then, the Great War. Of course, that had shattered communities across Wales and worldwide, but it also prompted and inspired some of the biggest responses as a peace movement that both Wales and the world have ever seen. And many of the stories of our great-grandparents, grandparents, and indeed mothers and fathers of generations had been lost to history with the passage of time and the passage of generations working through different projects and organizations, but many of them have been rediscovered, and we're sort of on a journey of rediscovery at the moment of uncovering Wales's peace heritage. I'll explain a little bit more about the women in the picture in a second, but just to say a little bit more about my own background. As Susan said, I'm the Heritage Advisor based with the Temple of Peace with the Welsh Centre for International Affairs. Very grand sounding title, but we're actually quite a small charity based in this beautiful building. The WCIA's work focuses on three main areas. It's supporting organisations, communities across Wales to contribute towards global learning, working with schools and in adult education and universities. Um, Global Action, which is focusing on campaigning and volunteering, ranging from issues like climate change to international exchange. And then global partnerships, the third, which is supporting organizations to make links around the world. Now, the Temple of Peace was founded as Wales's memorial to the fallen of the First World War. It's a beautiful building in the heart of Cathays Park in Cardiff. It's just opposite the National War Memorial in Alexandra Gardens. And it within its foundations, it houses the Book of Remembrance, the roll call of the fallen of the First World War, and in its ground floor is the Temple of Peace itself, magnificent, great big space that was intended to bring communities of Wales and the world together to facilitate conversation, discussion, and togetherness, and to sort of navigate Wales's way in the world, to try with the overall mission of trying to um, avoid conflict in the future. That was the mission of the Temple of Peace, and the reason why it was connected as a memorial to the First World War was the intention of that generation that no other generation should have to go through the loss that had been suffered in the First World War. The tragedy of the temple story is it was opened in 1938, just 10 months before the Second World War broke out. But what we have realized with uncovering the hidden histories of many of the campaigns that had been worked on by the peace movement in the 20s and 30s was that where once there had been a narrative that they had failed because the Second World War broke out and isn't that terrible, everything went wrong. Actually, if you take a longer view of history, many of the institutions and ideas that emerged after the Second World War that essentially became the architecture of the United Nations and many of the bodies of international cooperation that we've taken for granted to this day, many of them have their foundations in ideas and blueprints and frameworks that were developed in the 20s and 30s by the peace movements of Wales, but working with peace movements elsewhere across the world. None of the United Nations didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of ideas that had been developed by peace campaigners in the 20s and 30s. And so that's I think the big picture of what makes these hidden histories so fascinating. So a few years back, this is 2014, so actually 10 years ago, a decade ago, my colleague on the left here, Martin Pollard, who was previously chief executive for WCIA, was pulling together a project to mark the centenary of the First World War called Wales for Peace, which was the project that I initially joined WCIA with. And whilst they were exploring that project, they were looking through the library to see if there were old materials and records that could perhaps be part of this project. And they pulled out this leather binding he's holding here with this incredible inscription in gold leaf on the front. This memorial signed by 390,296 women from Wales and Monmouthshire to the women of the United States of America. Now, at the time, we didn't know enough about this to even be able to write a caption to explain what it was. It was just an incredible statement, very beautiful document, but completely lost in hidden history. And so, through the efforts of volunteers and students and researchers and campaigners over a number of years, uh, we started to piece together the story that sat behind this. And that's where this remarkable photo was initially unearthed by contacts in America, actually. This is a photo of four women standing on the steps of the White House. And the quote is actually from the petition itself. May we hand down to the generations who come after us the proud heritage of a warless world. That's the ending of that declaration that had been signed by nearly 400,000 Welsh women. That's an incredible scale of campaign to think about today. I mean, you couldn't even do that electronically nowadays. And so that has grown over the last few years, particularly through the efforts of networks like Heddwch Mamgi, and a number of organisations have been part of that, into a centenary campaign, which many of you will be aware of already, of the Women's Peace Petition. And not only was the petition rediscovered and found to still exist in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, but in 2023 it was returned to Wales, or as we like to call it, rematriated. The oak chest is now at the National Library, and we've been going through the process over the last few years of digitizing all the signatories, so that you can rediscover who signed it and where, and uncover many of the stories from that. Now, this links across to the churches in a number of ways. Firstly, this turned out to be one of a number of huge campaigns for world peace that the Welsh League of Nations Union started in the 1920s. Now, the WLNU was WCIA's ancestor organisation, I suppose, our grandmother, as it were, as an organisation. And their first campaign was the Children of Wales, now known as the Peace and Goodwill Message. That was the very first campaign that they started, and of course, that continues to this day. The Women of Wales and the Women's Peace Petition was the second campaign they did. Teachers developed the first global education curriculum, and then we have these two statements about the churches of Wales. And this was a little bit of a mystery until we found what appeared to be a matching petition. So this other petition on the right-hand side was also then discovered in the Temple of Peace archives. And this is a memorial from leaders of religious bodies in Wales to the Federal Council of the Churches of Christ in America. 1925. So this was a campaign done just a year after the Women's Peace Petition. And of course, that means the centenary will follow just a year after the current Women's Peace Petition centenary. So I'm just going to share a short video. I'm just going to play the first minute and a half or so of this. This was put together by one of our lovely volunteers who pieced together a little bit of the origin story behind the petition, and then I'll hand over to Gethin to talk a little bit more about where we're hoping to go forward from here. So I'll just, I'm hoping that this will work. Are you seeing the video, by the way? Yes, good, great.
Yes, not hearing.
Okay, I'm hoping.
Following the success of the Welsh Women's Peace
Now we
Appeal
are.
in 2023, Professor Charles Kingsley Webster was inspired to draw the churches in Wales and the churches in America closer together in their common effort for the aim of world peace. The aim was to create a petition by the Welsh churches that could be presented at the Federal Council of Churches in America in December of 1925. Similar to the Women's Peace Appeal, they were hoping to get America closer to joining the League of Nations. As they had a few months to get this project underway, it was not achievable to get all the churches in Wales to sign the petition. Instead, the plan was to submit the proposal to the official representatives of the religious bodies.
I will deem it a duty and a privilege to sign the appeal to American churches. you may add my name to the memorial to the Churches of America with pleasure.
And I'll bring it to a pause there because we're about to hear from Gethin, but he is with us in 3 dimensions. So I think that would be a sensible moment for me to pass the talking stick over, if I can work out how to get this off my screen. 2 seconds. Sorry. There we go. Okay. I hope that was a helpful introduction to the background to the petition. And Gethin, perhaps if I can pass over to you. And I'm happy to take any questions at the end.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch yn fawr.
Gethin, you're still on mute, I think.
Yep, that's fine. Is my screen shared? It's one of the oddities of Zoom, isn't it? That I am the one person who can't tell whether that's worked or not. Yeah.
It is shared, though perhaps not in full screen mode.
Right, okay. This is the other thing that's odd about Zoom. Of course, it covers over the very thing you need to click to. Is that better?
Okay.
It's okay. We can still see the slides down the side.
Oh.
I think if you're able to reach the little thing in the bottom right-hand corner, that might put it to full screen.
Right. No, I can't because it's hidden by the. If you're able to see, I think I'll
I think it's not in slideshow mode. If that's
yes, it is. For me, it is. You see.
It's not for us.
Well,
I can't tell you which bit to press because they're in Welsh and I don't speak Welsh.
Well,
we can listen to the slides well, though.
Slideshow from beginning. I think we're going to have to leave it as it is, and my apologies.
That's all right. We can still read it and see it.
Okay. So a key link. You often have key individuals in these stories, and a key link between the women's petition and the church's memorial. It wasn't really a petition, as Abby has already explained on the video. It was a church leader's round robin letter, something which we've become very, very familiar with. I get sent these things in my work at least once a month, but they were novel in 1925. A key link was the Revd Gwilym Davies. You can see a very brief outline of his CV there. And crucially, he was director of the Welsh Council of the League of Nations Union, that grandmother of WCIA. And so he was instrumental in the background of the women's peace petition. Of course, he wasn't a woman, but he was instrumental in the background and the organization. And when they came back, the women from America, the picture we saw in the White House, they did speak to Calvin Coolidge, the then president, who was sympathetic but was unable to join politically the League of Nations. So in that sense, the petition did not get to where it wanted to get, at least as Craig said earlier, not at this stage, though it did in 1945, arguably. So he wondered what should be done next. And as we've already heard from Abby, what he decided, being a Baptist minister himself, was that a really good thing to do next would be to get the churches to do something similar. Now, of course, many of the people who signed the women's petition were church members themselves. League of Nations Union branches were based in churches in many cases. There was a huge church involvement already. So there was no point repeating the exercise, but just adding men. So instead, there was this move to get church leaders, as we would call them today, to sign. And we've already seen that cover, deliberately designed to look so similar that indeed, I think initially, Craig, it was mistaken, wasn't it, for another copy of the 1923-4 petition until people read it carefully.
It wasn't it?
And if you are able to see the screen well enough, what I've put on the right-hand side are the various congregational signatories, of whom there were quite a number, because there was the Congregational Union of North Wales, the Congregational Union of South Wales, the Congregational Union of Monmouthshire and the Union of Welsh Independents. So the Congregationalists had quite a big voice in this. The Presbyterian Church of England obviously didn't, because of course, it was in England. And the Churches of Christ didn't. And that's one question which, who knows, somebody may want to look into on behalf of the URC. But the Congregationalists had a full set of their officers for that year signing the memorial. We believe, until we're proved otherwise, I'm going to go on saying that this was the first time that leaders of free churches, who of course through the Free Church Federal Council had worked together for a generation and more on public issues, were joined by two bishops of the church in Wales, newly disestablished in 1920, so this was quite a novel thing for them, and also by a leader, of course they wouldn't use that terminology, of the Society of Friends, the Quakers in Wales. Nobody from the Catholic Church, and that is one of the interesting questions, historical questions. Why were the Catholic Church, it appears, not invited? And I say that because, very kindly, the archivists of the three Catholic dioceses in Wales have already looked through their archives for this period and drawn a blank. So they have concluded, it's always difficult, you historians will know, to conclude from a lack of evidence, but it does rather suggest that it's not that the Catholic bishops were invited and didn't wish to sign, but that they were not invited. That may tell us something about ecumenical relations at the time. And we would love to find out whether in the other correspondence between the others, there is any discussion of this possibility of Catholic involvement. Anyhow, the people who signed. It was sent, well, the original idea was to send it, but then Gwilym Davies took up a public subscription to pay his own fare to go to the USA in person, carrying that document with him so that he could speak at the annual assembly of the Federal Council of Churches of Christ in America. And his account of that journey is digitized on the website, which was in the invitation that you received to this meeting.
Gethin, can I just interrupt you for a moment and just we're still looking at the lovely picture of Gwilym Davies. Is that what you intend, or you want us to see later slides?
I mean, I can't explain this because my slides are moving forward, so I don't know quite what to do about this.
Are you sharing?
I mean, I could try again.
No, now it's moved. Now it's moved and we can see the signatures now.
Which is not what's on the screen. This is very confusing.
You're now showing slide 2 to us, which is good.
Okay, which is the signatures, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Can you now see the next slide?
No.
Right. I'm really sorry. I think I'll just talk because this is, I don't want to waste people's time faffing around with the technology.
Okay.
It's working perfectly for me.
I'm better with the technology. I'm better if I can read it.
Right. Well, I appreciate that, but I don't. I'm sorry. I'm in a room on my own. I don't quite know what I can do about it.
Please just carry on. It's absolutely fine.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I will. So Gwilym Davies's account of his journey is a fascinating one, and we can circulate the slides afterwards so you can read the bits of this if you don't actually want to go onto the whole website. What he said to the Federal Council of Churches in America to try and persuade them were, amongst other things, this: it took a world war to create the League of Nations. It would take nothing less than a world war to destroy it. Now, of course, we know what happened in the 1930s. And every time I read those words, it sends a shiver down my spine to think how accurately he saw the world situation as early as 1925. So, he goes on, I attempted to stress the need, as urgent as it is imperative, for the churches of Christ in every land, in a generation which has known the horror of war, to throw all their influence on the side of the one cooperative effort for an abiding peace. By all accounts, Gwilym Davies was an eloquent speaker. However, the Federal Council of Churches in America failed to reach agreement, something which some of us may recognize from ecumenical discussions in the intervening 100 years. They could not agree on whether they should or should not submit a request to the President of the USA to join the League of Nations. And in the full account, Gwilym Davies gives some very interesting insights into the views of the Churches of America at the time. Like the women before him, Gwilym Davies met with Calvin Coolidge. Again, he was courteous but non-committal. And as he was on his voyage on the way back on the ship, he reflected back on what he had found. Now, the first thing he had found very positively was ecumenism. He doesn't use the word, but that's what he'd found. This is worth quoting. A visit to the headquarters of the Federal Council in New York is to see what America can do in interdenominational organization. It is the common ground for the social activities of 28 Protestant bodies with an approximate membership of 20 millions. It is the laboratory in which the Churches of America are seeking collectively for the solution of difficult problems which none can solve alone. So he was inspired to see what might be possible in Britain. Now, in fact, of course, it took the Second World War for the British Council of Churches and in the 1950s, the Council of Churches for Wales, what is now Cytûn, to be formed. So again, Gwilym well ahead of his time, but in seeing what was already happening in America, what might be possible here. And he also found something else. In those days, there were still a large number of Welsh-based and indeed Welsh-speaking congregations in the USA, formed by, at that time, quite recent migrants from Wales. And so he adds, through the memorial, a new and closer link will be forged between the Churches of Wales and the Welsh Churches of America. And that alone would have been worth the effort. I think that's a fascinating comment, because the whole aim appeared to have failed at that point. It would be 20 years before it succeeded. And yet he felt it was worth the effort to have established not just interdenominational, but to have re-established international church links. Now, I want to mention another figure from the time who was also key, Bishop John Owen of St. David's, the Bishop of St. David's, the first Bishop of St. David's in the disestablished church in Wales. Now, Bishop John Owen was one of only 2 bishops to sign this memorial. The other was the Bishop of Monmouth. Why only 2? We already have some hints in the correspondence that there is a story. The other 4 Anglican bishops definitely were invited to sign and decided not to. But 2 of them broke ranks in that sense and did. And it's interesting and significant that Bishop John Owen, in the same year that he signed the petition, or signed the, I must stop calling it a petition because it wasn't, signed the Peace Memorial, also gathered together in St. David's Cathedral a celebration of the 1600th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. He gathered together folk and leaders from the Eastern Orthodox churches, who were not a big presence in Wales in 1925, but they were there, particularly in Cardiff. The Anglican Church, the Catholic Church, and the Free Churches. I'm not quite certain about the Quakers. But he therefore gathered together an even broader coalition than the Peace Memorial had managed to gather together in terms of signatures, but he gathered them together in person. And throughout 2025, come to Pembrokeshire, go to St. David's Cathedral, it's always worth going to, but go to it particularly because there will be a commemoration. He has a big grand tomb, Bishop John Owen, in the cathedral itself, and there will be a commemoration of his life and his ministry, including in particular those 2 things which form the centenary next year. So that's an encouragement. Come on holiday to Pembrokeshire, except for Susan, who already lives there, during the next year. So what do we want to do to commemorate this, as well as what St David's Cathedral is excellently already planning to do? Well, denomination and local historical societies who have links are already planning things. It so happens that the 70th anniversary of the death of Gwilym Davies falls in January 2025, right at the start of the centenary year. And there will be a meeting in a Baptist church in Cardiff on Sunday the 26th of January to commemorate Gwilym Davies's ministry and life, which, if you were able to see that slide earlier, I think that's the one you could see, what is a fascinating and very varied life indeed. I'm happy to circulate more details about as soon as they are confirmed, which I'm sure will be very soon, to those within reach of Cardiff. There will be a travelling exhibition, and I very much hope a publication. The travelling exhibition can come to your church if it's in Wales, or indeed we might even allow it over the border, possibly. And we very much hope to publish the fruits of, for example, the day in January about Gwilym Davies in the form of a bilingual publication. And indeed, Craig and I and others were in a planning meeting for that this very afternoon. There is the obvious link that I've already made with the ecumenical movement through what is now, of course, the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea next year. And the fact that in the person of Bishop John Owen 100 years ago, these things were linked, I think gives us license to link them again. And similarly, Christian Aid, I'm delighted to see the head of Christian Aid in Wales, Mary Neil, on the call. Christian Aid is celebrating its 80th anniversary in 2025, founded in 1945 under a different name. And we've already agreed that some of the commemorations of these two things can again be linked, because there are obvious links between Christian Aid's work for peace and justice and this peace petition 20 years earlier. And we also very much hope that we can, perhaps virtually, I don't think we're planning to raise a public subscription to send someone by boat to America this time, link with the Federal Council of the Churches of Christ in the USA, as they're now called, but the body still exists, the sister body of Cytûn. If anyone has contacts there, I really want to hear about it, because we've tried several routes through an American bishop, through email, and so on, and we're failing to get a response. But we really, really feel we'd be lacking in commemoration if we couldn't do it in some way together with the Federal Council today. So anyone with links, please let me know. And crucially, we want schools, local churches, faith groups and community organisations to get involved, to ponder what would a faith's peace, and I guess today it would be a faith's peace memorial rather than a church's peace memorial. In fact, everyone from Abbey onwards have asked me that. Why weren't other faith groups in Wales signing this memorial? And the answer was, well, those groups were very small, apart from the Jewish community in Wales in 1925, but there certainly was a Muslim community in Cardiff, for example. But I don't think it would have occurred to anyone, frankly, to have asked them, other than, again, possibly the Jewish community. But I imagine that today it would be done through the Interfaith Council for Wales rather than through Cytûn. Indeed, I had somebody, oddly enough, from one of the denominations ringing me about peace in the Middle East and asking that very question this very morning. Can we get the faith leaders to sign something, now about the situation in the Middle East? So what would a Faith's Peace Memorial 2025 say? And to whom would we send it this time? So that's a question we want people across Wales to ponder and contribute to. And there are two things which have already happened or are going to happen, both and, to which we want to link this. One is the Academi Heddwch, the Peace Academy of Wales, which is a network of academics who work across the various universities in Wales on peace history, are producing a conversation framework for the notion of Wales as a nation of peace. And we're hoping to slightly adapt that so for use specifically in churches, and maybe a different adaptation or the same one for use in other faith groups. And we can make sure you have the link to what already exists about that, but the actual conversation framework is on the verge of being published, I think I'm right in saying. And also just a fortnight ago, the United Nations, which is the outcome, as Craig said, of this whole story ultimately, the United Nations held its Summit of the Future, which agreed to appoint, as a United Nations, the Special Envoy for Future Generations, modelled on the Future Generations Commissioner established 10 years ago in Wales. And so there is a direct Welsh influence on the body that eventually was formed and the USA is part of in contemporary life. So making those connections with today. And finally, I've already said a few questions to you historians and which we're going to ask historians in Wales in the Peace Academy and elsewhere to look at. Other questions that we're interested in. How was the wording of the appeal agreed, for example? It's my job these days sometimes to try and get agreed wording between church leaders on things. With all the benefits of modern technology and email, by golly, it's hard work. Do it by post, not even telephone, of course, but just by post. Unfortunately, most of these people kept their correspondence. So there is quite a volume of correspondence, some of which has been digitized, is already available to those who wish to read it. But there are other bits in archives which have not yet been digitized. We'd love someone to go and look through those. And by the way, if you don't speak Welsh, nearly all these people, although they did speak Welsh, in fact, wrote to each other in English, because that was the language of education. It was the language in which they'd learned to read and write. Clearly, Gwilym Davies had a role in using the wording and format of the women's peace petition. It is very similar, but it's not identical. So what role did church leaders play in fiddling around with the wording? And unless church leaders 100 years ago are very different from the ones today, they did fiddle around with the wording. How did each denomination decide whether or not to sign? Who decided with what consultation? And a Quaker historian has already said that he is 99% certain that the person who signed on behalf of the Society of Friends had no authority from the Society of Friends to do so. There may be similar stories in other denominations. I'd love to learn about them. Were local congregations involved in the process, and particularly, of course, in the congregational churches? Or did the leaders just sign without asking their congregations? Couldn't happen today, of course. And how was it publicised within local churches after it had been signed? Was there awareness locally of this, or was it simply an elite level thing? And we don't know the answer to that yet. Who decided which denominations to advise? I've already mentioned the question why the Catholic Church wasn't included, and I would add, as I say, why were smaller denominations like the Churches of Christ not included? Because they certainly had a significant presence in Wales in 1925. And why did only 2 of the 6 Church in Wales bishops sign? Did the women involved in 1923 to 4, a majority of whom surely were church members, did they get involved in this church's memorial? It was, of course, signed only by men, because only men were church leaders. Or were they frozen out of this process? I think that's a really interesting contemporary question as well. And I'm grateful to David Thompson of this society for this question, to which I still don't know any hint of an answer. Was there any link with the COPEC, Christian Conference on Peace, Economics and Citizenship, in Birmingham in 1924, which failed to reach agreement on a declaration on peace? But only the year before, were there people from, well, we believe there were people from Wales. Who were the people from Wales there? And do they overlap with the signatories of this memorial? So there are plenty more, but there are a whole load of fascinating questions for historians. Anyone who wants to volunteer to pursue one of those questions, we would just be delighted. We're looking for others as well, because we really would like to know the answers to these, not just out of curiosity, although of course we are curious, but also because all of these questions from 100 years ago have huge resonance for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Gethin, so much. And you'll be delighted to know that we were seeing the slides after that hiccup. So we actually saw the slides as we went through. And thank you very much for that. You're right that there could hardly be an issue more resonant with today's world and the need for people of faith to speak and act for peace. And fascinating to hear how it became, this story became part of the formation of the ecumenical movement, you know, where churches actually were impelled to work together for peace. So thank you for that. I'd be fascinated to know if anyone can answer some of your questions. There is, I see a raised hand, and people do remember to use the tools for raising hands or just wave at me and we will have a time for questions. So Robert Pope.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was really interesting. I wanted to half make a point or make a half point and then ask a question. So the half point I wanted to make is my memory, which is not very good and it's going back quite a long time, is that the Welsh School of Social Service is what fed into the COPAC conferences. And I was wondering in my head whether there was any link between the Welsh School of Social Services and the peace petitions. My memory too is that I have a feeling that Gwilym Davies was part of the COPAC discussions, but I may be wrong there. I can check it because I've got copies of the COPAC reports on my shelf over there. I just can't reach from here, or I'd have done it by now. My question though is, I was really interested in the kind of mission of Wales being a nation of peace. And I wondered to what extent there was a sense among those who organised the petitions that this was something that was important for Wales to do on the world stage. One of the things that I noticed among others who were involved in the social movement at the time was that there was very much the sense that Wales is a mission on the world stage as a nation, and therefore should have a status of nation to be part of the League of Nations in order to fulfill its role. And I wondered what the link might, if anything has come clear about a link between those two. But thanks very much for that.
Thank you. Can I leave the second question to Craig, who I think knows more about that than I do? But thank you for the first point. I think you've just talked yourself into a bit of historical research, Robert, for which I'm immensely grateful, and I look forward to the outcome. And the Welsh School of Social Services is the grandmother, as it were, in the way the League of Nations Union is the grandmother of WCIA, is the grandmother of WCVA, the Wales Council for Voluntary Action, for which, coincidentally, my wife works. So that is a really interesting link, and I will make sure that I talk to them. I mean, not just to my wife, but I talk to other people in WCVA. So thank you for that. But Craig, I think, can probably say more about the world stage aspect.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, actually, I can also add a little bit on the Welsh School of Social Services element as well, because I guess one of the things which certainly became apparent exploring the individuals and movers and shakers who were involved with these campaigns was, like many today, they wore many different hats, and many of the women who pioneered the Women's Peace Petition, although it was done through the Welsh League of Nations Union as the main body, the main conversation that sort of started that campaign was at the Welsh School of Social Services. And I would not be at all surprised if that was then replicated in the following year's discussion, which I think would have been in Llandrindod, I think, from memory. And yes, it's an interesting point in terms of I hadn't made the connection with WCVA being the grandchild of that body, so that's a great link to make. In terms of the Nation of Peace, I mean, the most fascinating connection I can make is actually a quote from Gwilym Davies himself, who in a number of speeches that he made through the 20s would often talk about Wales fulfilling a role in the world to be a missionary nation for peace. That was I suppose the well, the mission of the Welsh League of Nations Union, really. That was how they characterised it, was to be a missionary nation for peace. And one of the things which I've found fascinating with researching and studying it is nowadays that chimes fantastically with, I suppose, what we might think of as national aspirations and identity and so on. But of course, at the time, it was very much the height of empire. I mean, the British Empire reached its greatest extent just, I think, 8 months before this campaign happened. You know, so one of the things that I find interesting and a little bit uncomfortable personally going through some of the archive material is that a lot of this campaigning is very much being done within an imperial mindset, but with a view to using empire in a benign way and trying to make amends for things that of a perhaps less savoury past, shall we say? But yeah, it's really interesting how many of the campaigners across Wales see Wales, because of its small nation status and its ability to be able to talk to others without aggression or fear of attack or all of that. There's a lot of that sort of language around being a missionary nation for peace, which I think matches beautifully to the aims today around sustainable development and so on.
Thank you, Craig. John Lander, please ask.
Yes, thank you. I had no knowledge of this at all before I listened to this, but my question is a very straightforward one. Was there in any sense a parallel organisation to either the petition or the memorial in other UK countries, England in particular, but Scotland and Northern Ireland, for example?
That's a really, really good question, and I've yet to see any suggestion of that from any other part of the UK. There was certainly a lot of League of Nations Union UK level activity and a lot of local branch activity. You know, places like Manchester and Birmingham and so on are very active, but there was no equivalent from what I've seen so far in, say, Scotland or Northern Ireland or entire regions of the UK. The first example that I can solidly point to is in the 1930s, when in 1935 there was a what was called the Peace Ballot, which was it's been dubbed by some academics as the world's first referendum, or Britain's first referendum or something like that. But it was actually a campaign by the League of Nations Union that put a series of quite complicated questions around the escalation of the arms trade in Europe to a public vote. And the whole League of Nations Union across the UK did pursue that, but actually Wales, 1,025,000 people responded out of the population of Wales to that, which obviously is over a third of the population. So Wales was massively disproportionately represented in that peace ballot, even still halfway through the 1930s. So I think it suggests that although the WLNU was participating in UK campaigns, they were very much that they were characterising it as wanting to top the polls and to kind of be that missionary nation for peace, as Gwilym said.
And it reflects partly, this isn't the whole answer, but partly undoubtedly is the different denominational balance in Wales. No established church by 1925, but in any case, even when there was an established church, the majority were not members of it. They were members of nonconformist churches. Being an Anglican had been a minority sport. Oddly enough, the church in Wales is now the biggest denomination in Wales, but it wasn't then. And whereas, of course, in England, the Church of England was a national church, in Scotland, the Church of Scotland was a national church, and had supported the war effort much more wholeheartedly than the nonconformist churches did. I mean, some of them were positively opposed to the war effort, of course, the Quakers in particular, but to a large extent the Welsh Independents and Welsh Baptists as well. And the Presbyterian Church of Wales, as it's now called, the Calvinistic Methodists, were pretty well split down the middle. So that different denominational balance meant that people came at this from a different angle, and in that makes the disproportionate response to things like the peace ballot less surprising, because of the teaching that people were subject to in their religious life and in the general society. So the preponderance of nonconformity uniquely amongst the four nations, I think, is at least a partial explanation for why these things took off in Wales to a greater extent than they did elsewhere in the UK.
Thank you.
So the ask, as it were, for the memorial and the petition was to join, that the US would join the League of Nations. It wasn't per se a pacifist memorial. So
no, that's right, and that is, I mean, clearly that was drawn up. I mean, of course, it was the Welsh League of Nations Union, so I mean, obviously that was their job. And by the way, one of the reasons why the Quaker historian thinks that it was an unofficial signature on behalf of the Quakers is the Quakers actually were not in favour of the League of Nations because of its belief in collective security, i.e. in the possibility of armed conflict to defend against aggression, which of course Quakers couldn't sign up to, which is why it is so surprising to see a Quaker signature on this particular memorial. But there's a personal friendship between that signatory and Gwilym Davies, which may well be the explanation for his presence there. But he signed in the name of his office, which we think was without authority. So again, that shows a slightly different, the one dubious signature is not someone who didn't support the League, it was someone who supported the League of Nations for the very opposite reason, for the reasons why the Americans didn't support the League of Nations, which is itself a very interesting indication of the whole spectrum of views.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. I can see Alan would like to ask a question. Alan.
I would. I think I'm perhaps taking issue with Gethin slightly, and that is, I don't think the Church of England or the Church of Scotland national churches, or were, I think they're established. And I think that those of us who were nonconformists would have found a description of a national church as being slightly offensive. But never mind. I also don't think that you should push the empire thing too fast or too far. We've just had the Southern Ireland itself, the Republic, breaking away from the UK, as it were, and they're going to leave the empire. And we've got Gandhi and the Congress Party in India, and British India was massive then, not just India as it is now, but much bigger territorially, and they were pushing against the empire. So I think the empire we should be slightly careful about. May have been bigger territorially, but it's beginning to split. So but my question really is, were the Unitarians involved? We've gone into the question about whether Catholics were asked, and they appear not to have been, but Unitarians later appear not to be included in ecumenical discussions. John Huxtable was anti-Unitarian, wouldn't even regard them as churches. So I want to know what was going on in the 1920s in Wales.
Thanks, Alan.
Yeah, well, of course, Alan is right about national and established. I've just come a couple of weeks ago back from Scotland, where, of course, the Church of Scotland is very insistent it's not established either, and they prefer the term national church, so we can argue about the words. I was trying not to go into that kind of detail at this point, but Alan is absolutely right. Of course, the Church of England was an established church, and certainly nobody in Wales thought of it as a national church because it was the Church of England, obviously. So that is absolutely correct. On the question of the Unitarians, I think the answer is no. It wouldn't have occurred to anyone to have included them, just as the Muslims weren't included at that stage. Unitarian Church, of course, still cannot be admitted to Cytûn or to churches together in Britain and Ireland because of their Trinitarian basis. And that's 100 years on. So I think in 1925, my suspicion is, again, it's difficult to argue from absence, but my suspicion is the question didn't arise. The one hesitation I have in saying that with absolute certainty is that the Unitarians were quite strong in Wales, particularly in southwest Wales, the so-called Smotyn D, the black spot. And of course, the name tells you what other Christians thought about them. Black there was I'm afraid, an insult. But the black spot in Carmarthenshire was one where the preponderant nonconformist denomination in those days was the Unitarians. And day to day, the chapels seem to have got on well. It was only when push came to shove. And of course, this memorial was not on a doctrinal matter in any way, shape or form. So if they weren't invited, I mean, clearly if they were invited, they chose not to sign, and the evidence may exist. My suspicion is they weren't invited simply because it just didn't occur to people like Gwilym Davies to invite them. Just as there are certain partners who don't occur to us, I don't think it occurs to us very often, for example, to ask the Jehovah's Witnesses to sign things that we are signing as Christians, although of course from their point of view they are Christians. I think, I'm not comparing Unitarians and Jehovah's Witnesses in any other way, but I think in that respect the question probably didn't arise, but who knows.
Thank you, Gethin. Thank you. Now I think this probably needs to be the last question. So Chris Abbas. Chris.
Oh yes, well it's not really a question actually, it's just I love how this concept has grown, hasn't it? It's been like a seed transforming into a plant really, in that, we had, first of all, we heard about the message from the youth, and then the women, which I think takes my heart as another woman. I really feel that, their desperation to see a warless world is something that has to carry on. I'm so glad the church leaders, carried that on, and we need to say, well, that goal has not been achieved yet, so we have to carry it on. And to actually now say, let's also include people of all faiths, so that it expands, and it has to expand until it reaches the grassroots levels of all our villages, all our towns, all our cities, all our streets, because only when all those voices together are saying we want a warless world, I think will people sit up and listen, those people that can do anything about it, that is.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Craig and Gethin, do you want to make one final comment on that, or an encouragement for us somehow to do something like this again in our time?
I think that's brilliant, Chris. I hope Chris doesn't mind me saying, I know Chris quite well, that she's from the Baha'i faith. So very much appreciate what you've just said, Chris. And part of the aim of the commemoration is not just to commemorate the history, which is what we've majored on today, because of course you're a history society, but to do exactly what Chris has very eloquently described. So that is indeed our aim in 2025. And we have already invited other faiths to join us, and I'll be reiterating that invitation at the Interfaith Council for Wales, which Chris will be present at in a fortnight's time.
Fantastic. Yes, I don't think I could better Chris's appeal at the end there as to the reason why it would be fantastic to mark the centenary in a positive way. But yeah, again, I'd echo that the reason why WCIA works on our heritage when actually most of our work is very contemporary and looking to the future. The reason we draw on our heritage is because it can inspire and it can act as a catalyst and an impulse to be able to see that fantastic campaigns can be done and that great things can be achieved through linking with people around the world. And if we can use this campaign to inspire a new generation of internationalists in churches and communities, and to make the connections between local churches and schools and youth groups and so on, and to be able to then articulate, well, what is it that we want from peace today? What does that mean to a new generation? Then that is what ultimately will be the legacy of this centenary project. Is not just the history, but actually it's creating a new history that hopefully in 100 years' time, we might have some descendants looking back at what they did in 2025.
Thank you.
And actually,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Susan, Craig and I said we were going to start with this and we forgot in the way we do. I do want to particularly thank the URC History Society for donating to the costs of the commemoration.
Oh, yeah.
Next year, give you that and say so grateful for that contribution. We promise it'll be well spent in the ways we've described.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
One of the things that interest me about the story of the women's petition is that apparently it's quite obvious from the order that the signatures appear that they went round from chapel to chapel, and you can identify which chapel community or which church community signed it. And you know, the population of Wales is about 3 million now, and 390,000 women and more signed this. So you know, the extent of that involvement and engagement in this petition is extraordinary. And the fact that then the church leaders must have felt they must do something as well. So this is a remarkable story, and I'm very grateful. We're all very grateful to you, Craig and Gethin, for telling it so eloquently. And it's been wonderful to see the links in the chat so that we can follow things up. I'd just like to say that there is a wonderful book called The Appeal, edited by Jenny Mathers and Mairead Hopwood, in which Craig has a chapter telling the story of the women's petition. And it's a great read. So that would be well worth following up.
Thank you very much. Available from Lolva if anyone is wanting to find a copy, and it's not in your local bookshop. From
where, Craig?
From Lolva, so LOLFA, printing press up near Aberystwyth in Talibon. They've got a website as well, which is Lolva. So
it's there in the chat. Yeah. Thank you. So can we say a huge thank you, Diolch yn fawr, to Gethin and to Craig for this really excellent talk. Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr. Thank you so much.
Yeah, diolch i chi.